A map carved in secrecy, a path that leads only to ruin. Welcome to Viking Valhalla. I'm your host. Let me know where you're listening from. This community of explorers is incredible. Every message deepens the mystery. Let's follow the trail. The birchwood shard was not much to look at. Just a thin curve of pale bark, curled at the edges by time and moisture. It had lain silent for centuries, beneath layers of ash, beneath a hearth that no longer warmed. When it was uncovered, in a ruined longhouse far north where frost never truly left the ground, it was not the object itself that stirred unease. It was what had been marked upon it. Fine, charcoal-black lines, faded but deliberate, moved across the surface, not with the precision of modern mapping, but with the softness of thought. They wandered like memory rather than marched like roads. Some arced gently outward, then vanished. Others doubled back, intersecting as if remembering something long buried. These were not directions meant to be followed in haste. These were remnants of ritual, a path of rhythm, a guide for feet that no longer walked. In the dim quiet of the archaeology tent, beneath buzzing light and damp breath, the shard was laid out like a prayer. Every line was measured, every curve was traced. But no one could say, with certainty, what it meant. Not because it was unclear, but because it felt too clear, too emotionally articulate, to be merely geographical. One scholar suggested it was a funerary record. Another believed it was a charm, protective, warning, sacred. A third whispered that it was a place the people had been told to forget. The runes near the edge, symbols burned in with something more than ink, carved too deep into soft birch, were old enough to predate Viking unification, older even than the earliest sagas. They bore no names, only a sense of invocation, of danger folded into tradition. It was not the first map found beneath the remnants of a Viking hearth, nor the only one to resist explanation. Across the northern world, from the Faroe Islands to Upland, similar fragments had appeared. Always small, always incomplete. Many carved on wood, some traced into thin lead strips, others barely visible beneath soot and time. They were rarely discovered in burial mounds or ship graves where formality reigned. Instead, they were found in places of pause, hearths, storage lofts, even beneath the thick fur mats of sleeping platforms, as though the maps were meant not for travel, but for dreaming, as though the journeys they marked were taken not by feet, but by memory, by the soul. What connects them is not precision, but atmosphere. None follow rivers or trade routes, none outline kingdoms or estates. Instead, they drift toward silence, toward places lost not by geography, but by choice. In some, the lines seem to dissolve into symbols, not letters, but sigils. In others, the paths spiral inward, collapsing into a single rune scratched with unsettling force. One such symbol, found in 3 separate fragments across distant sites, has no counterpart in known Viking alphabets, and yet it appears consistently, not varied, not guessed, as though those who made the marks shared something unspoken, a knowing passed down not by word, but by ritual, and always the symbol lies at the end, at the conclusion of the path. Modern analysis offers little. Radiocarbon dating suggests the birchwood shard is older than most Viking Age artifacts, perhaps by centuries. The ink, or what remains of it, holds traces of charcoal, bone ash, and iron-rich soil, ingredients known in both artistic pigment and funerary rites. The lines do not align with celestial maps. They do not match coastlines or the flow of known rivers. Yet in one case, the arc of a path mirrored the curvature of a stone wall buried beneath a farmstead in Vestfold. A wall that encircled nothing, a wall that led nowhere. Perhaps it is not a map at all, but a boundary, a circle to hold something in or out. The sagas say little, but they hum with hints. In the saga of the half-burnt men, an unnamed seer carves a line into wood and buries it near the hearth, muttering that it must not be disturbed for 9 winters. In Voluspa, the seeress speaks of paths not walked by men, nor beasts, nor gods. In skaldic verse, there are references to the Ash Road, the Sleeping Trail, and the Forgetting Bend. All evoke a movement that is not physical, a route into memory, shadow, or ritual, something taken not by the body but by the breath, and so the shard becomes more than evidence. It becomes invitation, not to decode, but to witness, to ask not what the lines mean, but why someone chose to draw them, why someone chose to keep them hidden, why in a world so shaped by the sea and the sword, someone turned inward, into ash and bark and silence. The hearth was once a place of speaking, a place where stories were passed, songs uncoiled from the tongue, and children fell asleep to the sound of old names. But beneath it, beneath the fire, beneath the warmth, something else was placed, a path of retreat, a route etched not for the living, but for those who remembered what must not be said. That the birch wood survived is a kind of accident. That it was found is a kind of question. It should have been ash. It should have curled into nothing under centuries of winter. And yet here it lies, thin, quiet, and waiting. Perhaps that is its final message. Not to explain, but to remain. To let the map lead not to a destination, but to the stillness before arrival, to the edge of what was once known and is now only feared. Not loudly, not urgently, but softly, with the kind of fear that carries memory, the kind that returns in dreams. In the end, it is not about where the path goes, it is about what it asks us to leave behind, about the silence that forms when we stop naming things, when we begin to feel what they once meant. And somewhere, in that silent curve of blackened birch, the old world watches. Not angry, not mournful, just waiting. Before the compass settled its needle toward dominion, before measurement demanded borders and direction insisted on angles, the world was found through other means. The Vikings did not begin their journeys with ink and scale. They began with breath, with memory, with rhythm and sky. Navigation was not imposed onto the world. It emerged from it, sung in low voices over long waters, carried in stories stitched into the wind. The sea was not something to be conquered, it was something to be listened to. What we call maps today, flat, precise, relentless in their accuracy, would have puzzled the seafaring Norse. They did not require such things. For them, the path was not etched in abstract space. It was held in the pulse of the oar, the pull of the current, the scent of salt over sand. They moved in patterns, not lines, in feelings, not formulas. The world revealed itself not in a glance, but over time, through repetition, intuition, and trust in what had been passed down by voice and by silence. Theirs was a mapping of memory. And memory, unlike measurement, forgets with purpose. Old Icelandic words like lead and stefna did not define place as a point on a grid, but as an intention, a direction of thought. One did not go northwest, one went half ut into the sea. One followed Vega, the way, but that way shifted depending on wind, mood, season, and story. A path to the same destination could be spoken differently by each village, and none would be wrong. Because the purpose was never absolute arrival. It was belonging, recognition, knowing when to stop, knowing when to turn back. Among the most haunting finds of this oral cartography are the carved pieces of wood, bone, and stone unearthed in graves, in cellars, and beside the entrances to longhouses. Small, crude shapes, not designed to be displayed, but held, touched, passed from one hand to another. They bear markings that drift, not grids, but spirals, slashes, arrows that bend like reeds. Some are carved into whale rib, some onto driftwood too brittle for age. Many are broken, not cleanly, but with intention, as if a piece of the memory had been removed on purpose. A forgetting made sacred. One fragment, discovered in Gotland and dated to the 9th century, bears 3 overlapping spirals, faint but deliberate, alongside a single rune that translates to succor, or guilt. Scholars do not agree on its meaning. Some see it as a warning, others a memorial. But the villagers who buried it left no explanation. Only its presence beneath a threshold suggests that it marked something one was not meant to cross again. These maps did not lead outward, they led inward, not toward new lands, but toward understanding, of fear, of reverence, of where pain had once been. There were roots that led forward. There were roots that led home. And there were roots that led into silence, not just because they ended, but because no one wished to speak of what lay beyond them. The sagas, too, carry fragments of this older mapping. In Egil's saga, the aging warrior poet refuses to give directions through a fjord where his brother died. He calls it the Black Turn and says nothing else. In the saga of the Greenlanders, a sailor carves a sign into driftwood and throws it overboard, saying only that the sea will know. It is not meant to be found again. It is meant to be carried away. These were not maps of geography. They were maps of experience, and experience, like tide, shifts. Some lines in these memory maps seem to spiral deliberately inward, as if to contain something. Others spread outward, jagged, like echoes of rupture. A few end suddenly, not with a mark, but with an empty space. That emptiness is not a mistake. It is the boundary of what was allowed to be remembered. And perhaps that is the deepest difference between the old maps and the ones we know. Ours insist on wholeness. They claim the land, the names, the scale. They chart without silence. But the Viking maps left room for absence, for grief, for places that were not lost, but sealed. In northern Sami tradition, still echoing ancient Norse practice, there exists the Sieidi, a sacred site not marked, but felt. It is remembered only by those who know how to listen. The direction is not north or south. It is this way, and that way changes depending on who asks and when. These are the echoes of a culture that maps not with sight, but with belonging, that preserves through forgetting. When the fragments are laid side by side, birch, bone, stone, a pattern begins to hum beneath the surface. Not one of places, but of feelings. Some pieces vibrate with unease, others with love, but all resist certainty. All speak of a world where to know the path was not to see it, but to feel the hush it carried, the caution, the care. One line, on a charred shard of antler found near Trondheim, curves upward and then doubles back on itself. Beneath it, faintly, the rune for drøm, dream. The scholar who documented it wept. She said it reminded her of something her grandmother once sang. Before maps told us where to go, they told us what to remember, and sometimes what to leave behind. In the still air of long-lost rooms, near the ashes of forgotten fires, the old maps remain, not as guidance, but as guardians of grief, of boundary, of memory. And the silence at their end is not emptiness. It is a choice. Some maps are not drawn to lead the way forward. They are drawn to close a door, to seal something that once cracked open too wide. In the world of the Vikings, where the sea stretched like breath and the land hummed with lineage, there were places not meant to be found again. Places where something went wrong, or something sacred had been disturbed. Places too heavy with memory, too thick with grief or dread. And so they were not named. They were not spoken of. They were marked in other ways. The fragment found beneath the hearthstone, that sliver of birch with its dark curling lines, did not beckon. It warned. It was not a trail of guidance, but of retreat. A map not to follow, but to keep folded away. The lines curved back on themselves, bent inward, ended in silence. This was not a route for feet. It was a structure for forgetting. Among the Norse, there existed an unspoken tradition, the art of never going back. Memory was not just a tool for survival, it was a boundary. And in a world without fences or laws as we now know them, such boundaries were psychological, ritual, inherited. The Vikings did not always speak plainly of trauma, but they remembered where it had lived, and they built silence around it. Some families passed these places down, not through story, but through gesture. A glance avoided, a name not said, a finger traced along a piece of carved wood, and then quickly withdrawn. Children were taught not the tale, but the warning, not the reason, but the reaction. And in that hush, in that careful avoidance, an entire map of never again began to take shape. The archaeological record confirms this in fragments. Small bones etched with patterns that mirror no known geography. Wooden slats scorched black at the edge, then buried within the walls of homes. Pieces of broken pottery marked with symbols associated with turning, not movement, but reversal. These items are rarely accompanied by tools or offerings. They are solitary, intentionally incomplete, as if wholeness itself was the danger. In one longhouse ruin near Jämtland, a plank was found beneath what had once been a storage shelf. Its carvings were faint, worn by time, but they revealed a path that looped 4 times, each tighter than the last. At the center was a single rune, Loka. It means to close or to lure. The duality held in tension. Whether something was being shut away or kept at bay was unclear, but the intent was unmistakable. Do not reopen, do not return. The sagas rarely name such places directly, but they circle them. In the saga of Grettir, a cursed hill is spoken of only with reluctance and never visited twice. In the Book of Settlements, certain valleys are left blank or said to be given over to the Old Ones, a phrase whose meaning has long since faded, but whose echo remains uneasy. And in oral traditions that survived in remote fjord communities, elders remembered places one simply did not name when the wind turned a certain way. This form of negative mapping, of carving out rather than pointing toward, was not only practical, it was psychological, emotional. A society without written law relied on memory to anchor identity. But to remain whole, some parts of memory had to be made still. These maps helped do that. They allowed the unspoken to exist without overwhelming. They drew a quiet line, not across the land, but across experience. This far and no farther. In Greenland, an excavation near the edge of a cliff revealed something strange. A set of stones, too evenly spaced to be natural, forming a curve that suggested a path, but one that ended abruptly at a wall of turf. Beneath it, buried in the soil, was a small piece of walrus ivory, carved with 2 symbols, one for journey, one for rest. But their placement was reversed, as though to say, here, do not continue. Here, the journey does not bring peace. Modern science, with all its instruments, can trace the age of such items. It can examine the soil, the soot, the wear on the wood. But it cannot quite measure intent. It cannot quantify the silence left behind. That silence, though, is everywhere. In the broken lines, in the way a map refuses to lead, in the way it bends back upon itself. Not lost, but choosing to vanish. This was a different kind of wisdom, one not written in runes or rules, but felt across generations. The wisdom of absence, of knowing that not all knowledge should be shared, that some wounds do not belong in story, only in gesture. A tilted head, a line avoided, a path remembered not to walk again, To modern eyes, it may look like superstition or fear, but to those who lived with the land, who shaped it and were shaped by it, such boundaries were as real as any fjord or mountain. They were not just physical places. They were emotional territories, sacred exclusions, and the map, this one, the sliver of birch, held one of those exclusions. Not by accident, but by ancestral design. It marked a dead end not of geography, but of memory. The kind passed down without words, the kind that lingers in the marrow. Perhaps the most human kind of map is the one that says, "Do not return," because return is not always healing. Sometimes it is unraveling. The Vikings, in their stillness and their storms, knew this, and in knowing, they carved silence not only into wood, but into the rhythm of their lives. Some maps lead you home, some lead you onward, and some, like this one, lead only to the edge of what must not be named, and ask you, quietly, to turn back. Secrets in the Viking world were not always spoken. They were touched, folded, pressed into the very fabric of what could survive time. While words could betray or vanish, materials endured. The map found beneath the hearth was one such artifact, a quiet rebellion against forgetting, a whisper held in bark and blood. It had no ink, no ornate script, no grand etching, only burns and silence. Birch bark, delicate and ancient, was the chosen canvas, not parchment, not hide. Birch was alive in the Norse imagination, sacred, useful, abundant, and yet fleeting. It peels when the seasons change. It flares easily when touched by fire. But this piece, this slender strip that should have withered, had been made still. Someone had flattened it under pressure, perhaps using stone, bone, or fire-warmed iron, and then they sealed it. Resin, likely from pine, had been brushed across its face, not thickly, but with intent, preserving what mattered, binding what must not be lost. What was drawn onto it was not written in pigment, but burned, not with fire's rage, but with its precision. A thin, dark trail where heat had singed the fibers just enough to leave memory. Charcoal black, but not smudged. Controlled, curved, deliberate. The lines curved, then returned, as if trying to say something that could not be said aloud. There was no text, only gesture, captured in flame. On one ridge, just beneath where the bark began to splinter, something stranger lingered. A stain, thin but unmistakable. Deep reddish-brown, preserved by cold, by time, by ritual. Sheep's blood, not spilled, traced. Along the outermost edge of the bark, it followed the line of the burn as if echoing it, or warning it. Even now, when handled in the right chill, the stain retained a faint tackiness, a softness, like the residue of a vow. The blood may seem incidental to modern eyes, but in the Viking world it was sacred. It bound oaths, it consecrated stones, it soaked the corners of altars. Blood was not waste, it was memory made physical. In rituals, the blood of sheep or horses was often sprinkled over idols, over stones, over people, to bless, to bind, to seal, and in some cases, to erase. For blood was not only life, it was closure. That this map was touched with blood suggests something deeper than message. It suggests a ritual, a memory that demanded witness but not explanation. Something known to a small circle, perhaps a family, perhaps a group of settlers, and something feared enough or cherished enough to be preserved with this mix of natural elements, bark, fire, resin, and blood. Nothing more, nothing less. This was secrecy in the old form, not held in hidden books or locked chests, but folded into the very structure of what could be carried, buried, or burned. The Vikings understood that some truths were too fragile for language, and so they used the world itself to hold them. The soft inner peel of birch for memory, flame for shaping, resin for silence. blood for finality. These materials echo through the archaeological record. In burial sites across Norway, pressed birch is sometimes found beneath the remains, curled, darkened, but not burned away. In certain bogs, small bark scrolls, tightly wound and sealed in resin, have emerged whole from centuries of sleep. Their contents are often undeciphered, not because the markings are gone, but because they were never meant to be shared beyond the moment of making. Their meanings belonged only to the hands that shaped them. Sometimes the blood is missing, but the groove remains. A thin depression along the edge, as if a finger had traced the same line many times or something thicker had been smeared. Whether blood or oil or ash, these marks were not decoration. They were tactile punctuation. They told what the lines could not say. They turned maps into thresholds, and thresholds, in Viking thought, were never neutral. A threshold marked the point between world and underworld, between safety and risk, between what could be known and what must remain sacred. To step over a marked piece of birch, especially one sealed and stained, may have been to pass into memory. Not your own, but someone else's. To inherit, even for a moment, the silence they had kept. We do not know what this map was meant to hold back, or hold in, but its materials tell us that it mattered, that someone long ago believed this act of crafting, slow, painful, reverent, was necessary. That they chose birch not because it was easy, but because it was right. That they burned their memory rather than writing it. That they sealed it not for themselves, but for someone yet to come. Or for no one at all. The quiet technology of their secrecy lives on in the residue, not in the symbols, which fade, but in the process. We can see the pressure marks where stone met bark. We can trace the angle of the burn. We can still smell the resin, faint as pine in winter. And in the faint stain of blood we can feel a heartbeat, slowed but not vanished. This was not a story told. It was a story hidden in the body of the earth. Some secrets, the Vikings knew, must never be spoken, only felt through cold fingers, old wood, and silence. And this map, scorched, sealed, and streaked with blood, is not an invitation to understand. It is a reminder that not all memory belongs to the present. Some was made to be carried only in the hand, and then buried. There were stories in the north that did not warm the hall. Stories spoken only when the fire was low, when the wind scratched the walls like claws, and even the most hardened warriors stared into their ale without speaking. These were not tales of conquest or kin, not of Greenland's icy promise, nor of Vinland's brief sweetness. These were the stories of what lay beyond the frost-choked ridges, beyond even the brave maps of the Sea Kings. North beyond north. They called it Skymurk, Skydark, a name without welcome. It did not appear on the sagas in full form, not as a destination, not as a place to seek, but it lingered, in fragments, in hesitations, in warnings disguised as metaphors. There were whispers of black rock bays where ravens circled without leaving, where the sun rose too slowly, and when it did, its light was wrong, too pale, too far away. Crops would not root there. Bread could not rise. Fire took longer to catch, and when it did, it burned colder. The land absorbed warmth and gave nothing back. Some said that a few tried to settle there, long before Greenland, long before even the Western Isles were fully held. They were not kings, but outcasts, those who fled shame or curse or something unspoken. They brought ships and sheep, seed and iron, and hope sharper than frost. But hope does not till soil that does not listen, and the stories say they vanished. Slowly, without blood, without smoke. They simply did not return. The sagas mark their silence with phrases that unsettle. They sailed too far and were no longer warm. They touched the land that does not speak. They saw the sun at midnight and forgot their mothers' names. These are not records. These are echoes. and yet they appear again and again, especially in regions where the cold bites harder. In the north of Hålogaland, in isolated pockets of the Faroes, in the western fjords of Iceland, always as an edge, a warning, not drawn, but felt. And then there is the map, the one found beneath the hearth, the one marked in birch and blood. Its lines twist back, hesitate, then stretch northward, but not in confidence. The line wavers, doubles, then thins to nearly nothing. At its end is a burn deeper than the rest, as though the hand that made it pressed harder, or the fire flared stronger. Around that final mark, a faint ring of resin hardens into the bark like frost that refuses to melt. Some scholars believe the map ends there, not in a place, but in a refusal. A place that was marked so it would not be approached again. A memory sealed into form, a boundary made of line and fire. The ruins of Skymurtu have never been found. Or if they have, no one named them. There are hints, though. In the north of Greenland, at a wind-swept cape where nothing grows, a single iron nail was found embedded in basalt. It was not native to the area. It bore signs of Norse forging, but older than most known expeditions. No ship was found near it. No bones. Only the nail, as if it had been driven into stone in defiance or farewell. And in Iceland, near a ravine known as Dimudalur, the Dark Valley, an old woman once told an ethnographer of a place her great-grandmother called the Mouth of Forgetting, a bend in the cliffs where birds did not nest and where even moss avoided the stone. She had never gone, but her family had always left a small offering of ash there, once a year. No reason given, only that it must be done. When asked why, she said, because someone came back who should not have. Among the few who, according to legend, returned from Skymurk, none were whole. Not in body, perhaps, but certainly not in spirit. One saga fragment tells of a man who lived alone upon his return, speaking only to fire. Another of a woman who wove the same pattern into her cloth every day, refusing food unless it came from the sea. And then there is the phrase, spoken like an epitaph in many places. He could not get warm again. A haunting that was not ghost, but chill. A soul forever turned from the hearth. Modern scholars hesitate to call Skymurk real, but the consistency of the dread suggests something deeper than invention. Perhaps it was a place. Perhaps it was a metaphor, a memory given shape to contain fear. But the birch map's final mark, the one scorched too deep, gives weight to the tale. It does not guide. It stops. It does not name the destination. It declares its end. In Viking cosmology, not all lands were meant to be walked. There were 9 worlds, and some, like Niflheim, were of ice, of silence, of pain. The mythic mirrored the lived, and in that mirroring, Skymurk may have existed as both, a real attempt at reaching further, and the shadow that attempt left behind. The map does not lie, but neither does it explain. It marks, it ends. Somewhere beyond the last curve of the fjord, past where the seals gather, past where the whales turn away, there is a place known only by the choice to never name it. Sky dark, cold that remembers, and a silence that cannot be warmed. There is a point where language begins to bend, not break, not yet, but shimmer, where the shapes that once held meaning begin to twist against the eye, and even the most practiced reader feels doubt stir in the silence between the lines. At the edge of the birch bark map, where the trail of char burns to its deepest black, such a shape waits. A knot, coiled tightly, deliberately, pierced clean through by a single vertical line that runs downward, as though driven by force. It is not a rune that appears in the younger Futhark, nor in Elder, nor in any transitional or regional form. And yet it is not unfamiliar. Something about it triggers memory. Not recognition, but resemblance. Like a dream of a symbol seen through smoke. This symbol recurs. not just on the hearth map, but in other fragments found in distant places, carved faintly into a bone needle case in Nordland, traced in blood onto a stone beneath a collapsed roof beam in Skagafjordur, pressed into clay that was never fired, and so remained soft enough to carry time's fingerprint. In each case, it appears at the terminus, the end of the path, the final gesture. Scholars have not agreed on its purpose. Some assert that it is a grave marker, a stylized representation of binding, meant to anchor memory to the land. Others argue that it is not for the dead, but for the land itself, a ward, a seal, a closing, meant to hold something in place, or keep something from returning. What surrounds the symbol is even more unsettling. Runic characters, familiar at first, flicker along the edges of the bark, but their arrangement resists pattern. Letters collapse into one another. Some appear reversed, others are elongated, spiraled, nested. They resemble known runes but do not obey them. It is as though the writer began with the alphabet, then pulled it slowly apart, strand by strand, until it frayed into something private, something not meant to be shared. Even when fed through modern translation models, linguistic software, artificial intelligence trained on every variant of ancient Norse, the results are fragments, non-words, or worse, echoes of meaning that contradict one another. The same line might yield binding in one model and release in another. One system suggested the word cold, while another read return. No two readings aligned. The message, if it is a message, folds in on itself. This refusal to be read is not accidental. It is woven into the form. The map seems to gesture toward knowing, and then retract. A scholar once described it as an act of unwriting, not a text to be read, but a memory-resisting exposure, a ritual that turned language inward, as if meaning were meant to be sealed, not shared. In the Poetic Edda, there are hints of such things. In Havamal, Odin speaks of runes so secret they can bind the tongue, blind the enemy, unmake memory. Runes I know, he says, that are not known by kings or priests. Runes for sealing, for forgetting, for ending. The lore surrounding Galdrastafir, magical staves, also tells of symbols drawn not to reveal, but to obscure, shapes designed to twist perception, to dissuade the eye. Protection, yes, but also concealment. What the map may represent is not communication in the modern sense, but a closing of speech, an act of marking the end of something sacred, traumatic, or dangerous, in a form that no one, not even the one who made it, would ever be tempted to open again. It is possible the runes were meant to be known only once in the act of writing. After that, the meaning belonged to the bark, to the blood, to the silence it was sealed beneath. In Norse cosmology, the spoken word carried weight. To speak was to bind, to name was to claim, and to write, especially in runes, was not merely to record, it was to alter. Runes shaped fate, they shaped identity. But here, in this quiet fragment, runes were used to unshape, to blur, to fold memory inward like a stone in the sea. Even the coiled knot, that most persistent symbol, may not be a symbol at all, but a gesture, a representation of turning, of looping, of trapping something within. And the vertical line that pierces it? Some say it represents descent, not physical, but emotional, a falling into silence. Others believe it is the hammer stroke, the final act that fixes the spell, the nail in the coffin, the oath that seals. Whatever it was meant to say, it no longer does. Or perhaps it says only what it was meant to, that there is a place where language stops, where understanding must kneel before reverence, a boundary written not to be crossed, but to be obeyed. And so the runes remain, flickering like firelight against ancient walls. Refusing clarity, refusing translation. Their meaning lives not in the mind, but in the cold space beneath the hearth, where breath fades and ash remembers. Sometimes, to preserve a secret, one must write it so that even time forgets how to read. The story of Elder Hrafnsson begins like many tales of quiet obsession, in libraries, in salt-stained archives, in ink-thick rooms where the air itself forgets to move. He was not famous in his time. A modest cartographer by training, a historian by passion. Born in the coastal village of Ålesund, raised among fjords that fold the light, Elder had always been drawn to what maps left out, the spaces between certainty, the shadows beyond the line. In the spring of 1894, he set out to study a recently unearthed birch bark fragment that had been recovered from beneath a long-collapsed hearth in northern Nordland. The object had made little stir in academic circles, too small, too obscure. But to Elder, it was unlike anything he had ever seen. He wrote in his journal that the lines seemed to breathe against one another, that the burned marks held not just direction, but emotion. The curve trembles, he noted, as if the hand that made it feared its own path. He traced the map obsessively, redrew its curves, built scale models in wood and stone, trying to understand the geography it resisted. What unnerved him was not what it showed, but what it avoided. The line ends not in conclusion, he wrote to a colleague, but in deflection. It denies arrival. He began to suspect that the map did not describe terrain, but intention, a route taken only once, then hidden in shame. By late autumn, he had convinced himself that the map's final gesture, the deep coiled mark pierced by a single line, pointed not to metaphor, but to a real place. Not Greenland, not Vinland, but something colder, older, north beyond north. He called it the Forgetting Land. His letters grew erratic. The careful penmanship dissolved into slanting scratches. Sentences frayed into fragments. He wrote of winds that hold shapes and breaths that do not come from lungs. He spent long nights listening to wind through chimney flues, convinced that it carried voices. He began charting the patterns of breeze through his study with string, mapping the way smoke from his lamp curled before dying. "The air is not empty," he wrote in December. It recalls. In January, he left his boarding house in Bodø and did not say where he was going. He took a small sled, enough supplies for 5 days, and the map fragment sealed in waxcloth. He left behind a single page on his desk, torn from his journal. 3 words, written not with ink, but scorched into the paper with the tip of a fire poker. Lines are listening. Weeks passed. A search party was formed. On the 10th day, in a frozen bay near Skarsvåg, a place where the wind hammers the cliffs without rest, they found his boots. Upright, side by side, filled with snow but dry inside. There were no footprints leading to them, no trail, just the boots, and beside them a bundle of twine still wound, wrapped around a small stone etched with a spiral. He was never seen again. The incident did not make the newspapers. Only a brief mention in the Årbok for Nordnorske Historiker. His disappearance was dismissed as madness, exposure, the ravings of a lonely man swallowed by winter. But among a small handful of archivists and folklorists, Elder Hrafnsson's name lingers like a question spoken under breath. Some who have studied his papers say the spiral in his notes was not copied from the map. It was added, repeated, over and over, in margins, on napkins, on receipts. A coiling gesture that mimics thought collapsing. Some believe he did not vanish, not in the usual sense, that he followed the map where it was never meant to lead, that he crossed a boundary drawn not on land, but in language. And the phrase he left, "lines are listening," remains the most unsettling, for it implies that the map is not static, that it does not merely wait to be read, that it perceives, that it records more than terrain. It records the reader. To those who believe in the map's power, Hrafnsson was not the first to try tracing it, but he may have been the last to attempt it with the belief that it could be completed, that the silence at its end was not final. There is something about the boots that refuses to settle into logic. Left standing, aligned, not discarded in haste. It suggests ceremony, or surrender, or perhaps the completion of something only he could understand. In Norse burial traditions, boots were placed on the dead to prepare them for the long road. But here, the boots were empty, as if the journey had already been taken, as if the traveler had stepped out of them into something else. Modern interpretations range from the psychological to the supernatural. Some say he suffered a break with reality, that cold and loneliness opened a fault line in the mind. Others wonder whether the map or the symbol at its end holds more than memory, that it might be not just a relic, but a gate. The birch bark remains in a drawer at the University of Oslo, though it is rarely shown. Those who have examined it closely describe a strange sensation. Not fear exactly, but a narrowing of thought, a silence that seems to press inward, as though the map holds not only place, but the echo of those who tried to follow it. Elder Hrafnsson did not die in the usual way. There was no body, no grave, only absence. And the final mark he left, a spiral, a scorch and silence, continues to turn in the minds of those who remember. There are places maps should not lead, and lines that do not forgive being followed. Some curses do not arrive with thunder. They do not split sky or soil, do not wail through the rafters or bleed from the walls. Some curses arrive quietly, as breathlessness, as absence, as something once certain that no longer holds its shape. And in the far northern reaches where the map once lay, beneath frost, beneath ash, beneath the rhythm of forgotten fire, the silence it carried did not stay buried. It lingered, not as vengeance, but as residue. Local lore, spoken in kitchens and whispered during long winters, did not call it a curse outright. The word they used was klang, an echo. Remainder, something that follows not immediately, but patiently. The stories agree on only one thing, that to take from the place the map marked was to bring something back, and that what came back did not leave easily. There was the farmer who, in the early 20th century, uncovered a squat, moss-stained altar stone while digging a trench near Skarsvåg. The stone bore faint carvings, circular, flaking with lichen. He rolled it to the edge of his field and repurposed it as a foundation stone for a toolshed. By spring, every sheep in his care had died without visible wound. Not illness, not poison, just stillness. No sound in their passing, no struggle, as though something had asked them, gently, to stop. His daughter later said he never rebuilt the shed, that the stone was rolled back to where it came from in silence. No tools, no ceremony, just a long, wordless morning, and after, a man who no longer looked into the wind. Then there was the weaver, a woman named Solveig, known for her hands, for her patience. She had no children but passed her days making cloth with patience that was near reverence. At a midsummer gathering, she was shown a rubbing of the runes from the birch map. Intrigued, she traced their shapes into the border of a ceremonial shawl. She spoke to no one of it, but her voice, once strong and clear, fell quiet soon after, not in grief, not in refusal, simply gone. For 7 years she did not speak, not a sound. Physicians said the vocal cords were unharmed, that the mind was whole, but words did not come. She wrote only once, "It is not silence, it is listening." The shawl was later found buried beneath her floorboards, its threads unraveling, and in the last of the known stories, most often recounted in low tones when snow piled thickest and children grew restless by the fire, there is the boy. His name shifts depending on the teller: Oscar, Harry, even simply the child. He was 5, perhaps 6, and he lived near the cliff where Elder Hrafnson's boots were found. One day, while playing in the brittle heather, he traced the path from the map in the snow, backwards, inverted, reversed as children sometimes do, with more curiosity than caution. He returned home in tears, not from pain, but from confusion. His mother's face did not comfort him. Her name, once easily spoken, had vanished from his mouth, not as if forgotten, but erased. He called her the woman for nearly a year. She said he looked through her, not past, but through. The boy recovered, in time. But when grown, he never remained near his childhood home, and he never named his own children after family. These stories, dismissed by academics and preserved by grandmothers, do not scream. They do not offer spectacle, but they persist. In each, the curse, if it is a curse, does not strike like a weapon. It lingers like a fog. It alters not the body, but the boundary between memory and belonging. A thinning, a forgetting, a drift. Modern researchers tracing such tales often label them folk residue, the cultural detritus of a past misunderstood. But even they admit, reluctantly, that certain objects found near the map's presumed terminus exhibit strange properties. Iron nails that resist rust in salt air, birch that does not curl, even in heat, clay vessels with symbols that fade under light, then return in shade. Perhaps it is not a curse in the traditional sense. Perhaps it is something older, a defense, a warning, a ritual that was never meant to be broken open, and yet it was. Viking culture understood boundaries deeply, between worlds, between kin, between what was spoken and what was not. They marked those boundaries with wood, with blood, with silence. To inherit something taken from such a place may not be to inherit wealth or wisdom, but to inherit a weight, a burden once carefully hidden. Not all curses scream. Some arrive as a pause between names, a quiet in the throat, a memory that stutters then vanishes. And some, once taken home, refuse to leave. There is a quiet rhythm to sleep that the Vikings did not ignore. In a world where stars moved behind clouds and coastlines shifted like breath, not all journeys began with the setting of sail. Some began beneath closed eyes, beneath fur and sky, with the hush of tide and the long, low murmur of wind against skin. Among the Norse, sleep was not merely rest, it was ritual, a soft crossing between this world and the others. And sometimes it was used not to escape reality, but to navigate through it. They called it drømmesokken, dream-seeking. Not every village practiced it, not every seer believed in it, but those who did held it sacred. The sea, cold and constant, was their compass. To sleep beside it was to tune the mind to the rhythms of fate. A makeshift bed on stones or moss, a bowl of water left beside the head to catch the last dream's shadow, a question whispered into the dark. These were the tools. They did not ask for visions. They waited for them the way one waits for wind to change. Some dreams came as symbols, some as places, and a rare few emerged so vividly, so entirely shaped, that they were believed to be messages from beyond the known. Not prophecy, but memory pulled from another world. There are records, soft, fragmented, but persistent, of maps carved after dreams. Not traced from land, not guided by oar or sail, carved by those who had never walked the places they depicted. Places that did not exist in any chart and yet bore names. Runes not copied, but felt. Shapes not measured, but repeated with the kind of certainty only dream leaves behind. One saga, now only partial, tells of a man who saw a valley filled with water that did not reflect the sky. He carved its likeness into whalebone and buried it beneath his threshold. Another tale from the Faroe Islands speaks of a woman who dreamt of a ridge she'd never seen, where the sun rose twice. She awoke, weeping, and would not eat until the ridge had been carved into driftwood and sealed in resin. These were not hallucinations. To those who dreamed them, they were real. Not in the way a hill or river is real, but in the way a warning is. Felt, heeded, feared. And then there is the birch bark map, burned, blooded, sealed, and found beneath a hearth, where dreams once echoed with the hum of flame and voice. It bears the marks not of cartography, but of vision. Its lines do not follow the logic of land. They curve, double, falter, as if drawn not by hand, but by breath, as if shaped by the uneven rhythm of sleep itself. Some scholars believe it to be a cartography of nightmare, a record not of territory, but of terror, preserved because someone believed it must not be forgotten, or because someone feared what forgetting might bring. The coil at its end, pierced by that downward line. It appears in the margins of other dream maps too, less defined, less burned in, but there, always at the terminus, the boundary. A mark not of arrival, but of refusal. To sleep beside the sea was to trust that dreams could guide, that they could reveal what waking sight concealed. But dreams did not always soothe. Some brought back echoes too heavy to carry. Some left their weight in the bones. The dreamers, those few who tried to carve what they saw, often paid a price. Records speak of their withdrawal, their silences. One seer in Jämtland, known for dream carving on slate, vanished after her 10th vision. Another carved the same spiral for 13 winters before walking into the fjord. Modern understanding might call it madness, night terror, sleep paralysis. But in the Norse mind, it was contact with another world, another memory, another warning. And so, perhaps the cursed map was never meant to be used, only remembered. A relic not of exploration, but of witness. A dream that someone could not keep in the body, and so pressed into birch, sealed in resin, marked in blood. Sleep was their compass. Not because it brought certainty, but because it brought truth. And truth, in its oldest form, is what remains when names are gone, and only the shape of fear is left behind. The birch bark map may be a dream turned artifact, a nightmare turned scripture, not meant to guide the living, but to preserve the line that must not be crossed again. To see it is not to understand. It is to feel the weight of a night that never truly ended. And in that silence, the dream still listens. There is a story, seldom read and even more rarely spoken aloud, found in a crumbling vellum fragment kept in a locked drawer in Reykjavik. It is not part of the great cycles, not among the battles of kings or the quarrels of gods. It is not about conquest or glory or vengeance. It is about a woman, not born, but made, shaped of ash and of ice, and she does not speak often. But when she does, her words bruise the air. Scholars call the tale Askumekja saga, the saga of the ash wife. But it is not a saga in the traditional sense. It is short, strange, unpolished. The characters flicker into being and vanish before they're named twice. But she, the ash wife, remains, a figure who lives not in a house, but in a hollow, not sheltered by roof, but by memory, the kind too cold to thaw. She meets the hero, unnamed, near the moss fields east of Skagafjordur, where lowlands ripple soft as sleep and the ground itself seems to breathe. He asks her for guidance, as heroes do, but she does not offer direction. She offers a warning. "Do not go east of the moss," she says. There, the land remembers what the sky has tried to forget. And that is all. The phrasing unsettles. The sky forgets by moving, by raining, by sweeping things away, but the land holds, it absorbs, it seals. What falls into the earth stays, and in that eastward stretch beyond the moss, the ashwife implies something fell long ago, something too heavy for even the sky to carry, something the ground has not forgiven. The saga contains no battle, no beast, only this moment, and then silence. The hero, restless, sets out eastward despite the warning. The narrative moves with him, briefly. A few lines speak of low clouds, of birds that will not sing, of water that runs upward, briefly, then stills. And then the sentence breaks. A word, half-formed. A stroke of ink that fades into nothing. The next page is gone. Not torn, not erased. Gone. The vellum ends. Mid-thought. The scribe's hand simply stops. What lingers is not what happened next, but that no one chose to write it down. And it is here that the map returns. The cursed birch bark, burned and blooded, carries jagged strokes that mirror the description in the saga. A series of sharp, unsettled lines through lowland, veering east, then ending not in a mark, but in blank. A void. The bark is scorched more deeply here, as if the hand that made it hesitated, or pressed harder than intended. No place name follows, no rune, just silence in the grain. And the alignment is uncanny. Scholars have overlaid the map's marks atop known geography. The jagged lines do not follow rivers or trails, but they run through the same lowland fields where the ashwife's warning was given, toward a place unnamed, toward the edge of something even sagas refuse to say. The story's obscurity is not due to lack of beauty. Its language, what remains of it, is poetic, spare, crystalline. It is simply too unsettling, too uncertain. It asks more than it answers. It ends not with death, but with something worse. Erasure, the kind that suggests continuation, just not one meant for human eyes. And still, the ashwife's words remain. The land remembers what the sky forgets. Perhaps she was not a woman at all. Perhaps she was an echo of the land itself. A voice shaped by memory, smoke, and snow. One that warned not of danger, but of consequence. Of what happens when the forgotten is walked upon, when the sealed is opened. In Norse belief, land was not passive. It was alive, listening, storing. Stones held memory, water held spirit, moss held breath. To disturb these things carelessly was to invite not wrath, but imbalance, something quieter, colder, a slow forgetting of self, a blurring of name. The ashwife does not curse, she does not plead, she only warns, gently, firmly, and then disappears. And now, centuries later, we find her again, not in ink, but in bark, in the way the lines of the map mirror her unheeded caution, in the way the path ends not in place, but in refusal. What is not written matters. What the map does not show, what it leaves as blank, may be the most sacred warning of all. That to go east of the moss is not to find something. It is to lose the self that searches. And in that blank, the silence of the land deepens. In the summer of 1997, beneath a sky so pale it barely darkened, a small archaeological team gathered on a windswept ridge outside Nordkapp, the far north, where the earth wears silence like a second skin. It was not a large excavation. No ancient village, no ship burial, no grand hall. Just a rise in the ground that resisted grass, where the moss died back year after year without cause. A place the local herders avoided without comment. They found the beads first. Shallow, near the surface. A circle of glass, perhaps a meter wide, 23 in total, each no larger than a thumbnail, arranged not carelessly but with intention. Their color was the first confusion. Not blue, not green, but something in between. Like sea water seen through frost. Not like any found in known Viking burials. The closest match in hue came from Central Asia, but even those lacked the dull, almost bruised translucence of these. The soil around them was compact, undisturbed for centuries. No roots beneath, as if the earth itself had agreed to leave it untouched. Beneath the ring, a layer of ash. Charred wood, broken in pieces, blackened deep, but not from trees native to the region. The grain was wrong, too smooth, too tightly coiled. Later analysis suggested birch, but not of the northern species. This bark had grown where winters were shorter, somewhere far south of where it was found. Pressed into the lowest edge of the ash layer, wrapped in its own residue, was a brooch. Iron, rusted, fragile, no longer wearable, but unmistakable in shape. A coiled knot, pierced by a single downward line. The same symbol scorched into the birch bark map, the same mark that ended the path. It had not been dropped, it had been placed. No bones, no blades, no bowls or combs or spindle whorls. The usual echoes of Viking life, only ash, beads, and a brooch whose presence made the ground feel colder. The archaeologists, trained in method and detachment, did not speak of it directly, but their notes reflected unease. Phrases like ritual absence, deliberate clearing, negative space of habitation, as if what they found was not a settlement but a refusal of one, as if someone had worked not to build a place, but to erase it. One noted the absence of animal remains in the surrounding field. No bones, no droppings, not even the shallow impressions left by grazing hooves. Birds passed overhead but did not land. The place held nothing except what had been left to silence. Further soil samples revealed a high concentration of char and resin, suggesting an intense but localized fire, not wide enough to be destructive, focused, intentional, a cleansing, not of filth, but of memory. The local guide, when shown the brooch, turned pale. She did not touch it. She only said, "That should have stayed down." No one stayed overnight after that. The items were catalogued, photographed, and placed in temporary storage. But the brooch began to cause issues. The metal corroded unpredictably. It blackened glass shelves from beneath. One researcher reported hearing a low whine in the archive room when the brooch was nearby. Not loud, not constant, but rhythmic, like breath, or something mimicking it. Eventually, the items were relocated. Officially, they were archived in Tromsø. Unofficially, no one speaks of them. They are not displayed. They are not loaned. Because what they found at Nordkapp was not a sight. It was a silence made physical, a memory buried not to be honored, but to be withheld. Someone had tried, centuries ago, to make that place disappear. Not just from maps, but from minds, from mouths, from story. And yet, as always, the earth remembered. The beads with their strange hue may have marked a boundary, or a grave, or simply a warning. The ash may have come from the original map, burned in ritual, or from the hearth that once housed it. The brooch, that final mark, was not just ornament, it was closure, a seal, the absence of life around the site, the precision of the ring, the imported wood. None of it speaks loudly. But together, they hum, not with violence, but with purpose. Someone made a decision to end a story, and in doing so, left just enough for it to be found again. Sometimes archaeology reveals what was once lived, and sometimes it reveals what someone tried not to live again. In Nordkapp, they did not find a settlement. They found the trace of a forgetting. And even in the clean air of the far north, the soil still carries what no one was meant to remember. In the world of the Vikings, memory did not live on shelves. It moved with breath, with voice, with rhythm carried across firelight and wind. The Skalds, poets, but more than poets, were the keepers of what could not be written. They remembered not just facts, but feelings. They shaped moments into meter. They turned grief into sound, and through them the past was never still. it was performed. Alive. Fleeting. But not all poems were meant to endure. Some verses were whispered once, then scattered like ash into the dark. Ritual songs, composed, not to be remembered, but to be forgotten. Precisely, deliberately. These were not songs of praise or saga, not of heroes or gods. They were verses for closing, for binding, for laying something down so that it would not rise again. The Skalds knew the power of sound. They understood that a poem, like a rune, could shape the world. And so there were songs meant to warn, but not through fear, through beauty, through rhythm so subtle it lodged beneath the skin, unnoticed, a melody that echoed only when it was too late to unhear it. Fragments of these verses remain, but only barely. A single stanza in the Hrafnsmal that speaks of a path where light steps lie heavy. A scrap of rhyme in an Icelandic folk tale that warns, do not name the stone that remembers its name. The tone is not of epic, but of lullaby. And in that softness lies its strength. Some researchers believe that one such skald, long unnamed and now untraceable, composed not just a warning, but a map, a verse map, a path laid in rhythm rather than ink, its direction encoded in meter, its boundaries drawn not with lines, but with repetition, pause, and silence. The birch bark fragment, scorched, blood-traced, sealed in resin, may be its twin. Not a transcription, but a sibling, the visual echo of a sound no longer spoken. Both were meant to survive only in pieces, not to be preserved whole, because wholeness would invite use. And use was never the goal. The Skald's verse map may have been sung only once, at the moment of binding, a ritual song performed at the site later erased by fire and ash, the bark sealed after, the words allowed to vanish. Only their echo remains, in shape, in gesture, in the uneasy resonance of symbols that refuse translation. The art of forgetting was as sacred to the Skalds as the art of memory. They knew that some knowledge was too heavy for language, too dangerous for permanence. These were not secrets in the modern sense. They were not hidden. They were exposed, but softened, dissolved into tone, meant to slip away the moment they were spoken. There are patterns in surviving skaldic verse that suggest coded direction, references to landmarks no longer found, to rivers that run without water, to roads that end in the mouth of stone. These are not metaphors, some say. They are coordinates, disguised in poetry so intimate it became invisible. And perhaps the birch bark, with its burned lines and spiral seal, is the second half of the composition. One made in voice, the other in flame. Neither meant to last, and yet both do. Because fragments are hard to kill. The Skalds left no maps, but they left rhythm, breath, the sense of something shaped and then allowed to fall apart. They trusted the silence to carry what words could not. And now, centuries later, we hold these pieces. A line in a poem, a mark on bark, and we ask what they were trying to warn us of. But perhaps the Skald did not want us to know. Perhaps the knowing was the danger. And what they gave us instead was enough to feel the shape of fear, but not enough to follow it. A poem that ends mid-line, a map that ends in silence. This is not failure, it is design, and in that design, the Skalds sleep. Their warnings scattered like snow, falling, vanishing, but never quite gone. In the seafaring heart of the Viking world, names were not mere labels. They were anchors. To name a ship was to give it spirit, to invite protection, to place it firmly within the order of things. Each vessel, once shaped by axe and hand, was christened with a name spoken aloud and carved into its keel. Ormarin Langi, Islendingur, Kraka, names that carried fate, that sang through storm and wave. A nameless ship, then, was unthinkable, a breach of the invisible pact between ocean and ore. And yet, in the sagas, there are whispers, ships that left harbors in silence, that bore no name, no carved identity, no call across the waves, just movement, quiet, certain, final. These are not the ships of heroes or raids. They are not sent to conquer or even to trade. They are sent to disappear. One saga, Vatnsfjordursgatan, seldom read and never taught, mentions such a vessel. A black-hulled ship built in secrecy, launched under a new moon with only a single soul aboard. It bore no name, the line reads, and no man turned to watch it leave. No return is recorded. Another, more fragmented, speaks of a fleet of 3, unnamed, unblessed, and stripped of ornament. Their sails dyed dark, their hulls unmarked. They sailed west, but not toward Vineland. They sailed, it says, into the forgetting, where water does not echo and birds do not follow. The act of withholding a name was not ignorance, it was intention. A nameless ship was unanchored not just from identity, but from destiny. It invited no blessing from Njord, god of the sea. It asked no guidance from stars. It cut itself loose from the story, and in that erasure it disappeared not only from sight, but from song. The birch bark map, with its scorched silence at the end, may mark where such vessels were sent. Not to arrive, not to discover, but to dissolve. The final curve of the map leads not into port or inlet, but into absence, a place so unnamed that even the line itself hesitates as if uncertain how to end. A voyage drawn not for exploration, but for erasure. Archaeological records along the northernmost fjords have turned up mooring stones without matched debris. Places where ships once tied off, but left no planks, no nails, no carved tools, no trace of arrival, only the grooves in stone worn by rope and time. Marks of presence that speak more loudly because of what is missing. Why send a ship nameless? The theories range from ritual punishment to disease quarantine, from sacrificial offering to deliberate exile. But one thread remains constant, a desire to unmake, to allow something, someone, to vanish without pulling the world down around it. The Norse understood the danger of remembrance. They knew that to name something was to keep it close, that some griefs, some wrongs, some fears needed not to be remembered, but to be bound and cast adrift. And so they built ships that bore no name, that sailed under silence, that cut through water like breath in cold air, fleeting, vanishing. The birch bark map does not say as much. It cannot, but its final symbol, the pierced knot, may be more than a seal. It may be a vessel. A ship reduced to geometry, a journey reduced to silence. In Viking death rites, ships were sometimes burned, turned into fire and smoke, but not always. Some were sent off whole, pushed gently into the current, carrying the dead into mist. Not to be watched, not to be followed. The nameless ships may not have carried corpses. They may have carried memory, the kind that could not be buried, the kind that had to be released. And so they sailed, past fjord and frost, past birdsong and prayer, past even the edge of the map, not to land, but to vanish, because some voyages are not meant to return, and some stories are not meant to be told. There is a place, far in the north, where even summer forgets to arrive. To the eye, it is unremarkable, a curve of barren coastline tucked between cliffs, wind-worn and stark. But modern satellite scans, conducted almost by accident in the early 2000s, revealed something curious. The ground there remains white, even when the surrounding tundra blooms in moss and lichen, even when glacial melt scours nearby valleys, carving rivers in soil. This stretch of earth does not change, it does not warm. Snow does not melt across it. It glides around as if repelled, as if the ground beneath it has chosen not to remember the sun. Temperature sensors fail without explanation. Instruments flicker and reset. Readings stall at numbers too low to match the season. Researchers called it a data anomaly. Local Sami herders called it dauva chievra, the cold that listens, the cold that knows. Birds do not sing near it, not because they die, but because they leave. They skirt it in wide arcs, wings silent. Reindeer, unprompted, veer around its edge as if following a path no human can see, as if remembering something they were never taught. And here, just before the white land begins, the birch bark map ends, but the final line does not stop. It pulls. Unlike the others, which arc and double back in gentle hesitation, this last line is different. It strains forward. It thickens at the edge, as if the hand that made it pressed too hard, or fought not to, as if drawn not by intention, but by something stronger, a gravity not of earth, but of memory. Scholars once debated whether the map was finished. Some said the final line was a mistake, a slip of the stylus, but others saw it as the opposite, a moment of truth too heavy for the form, a surrender. The cold patch on the coast lies directly along that final trajectory, not marked, not named, but unmistakably there, as if the map tried to resist acknowledging it and failed. No one lives near the white stretch now. The nearest settlement, abandoned since the 1980s, had once thrived on fishing and reindeer trade, but stories grew. Of dogs howling through summer, of frost crawling up doors from inside, of voices that echoed with no speaker, not screams, not language, just the feeling of having been overheard. Satellite imagery shows no structures there, no grave mounds, no walls, no roads. But beneath the snow, always snow, the ground tells a different story. Ground-penetrating scans suggest scorched soil layers, inconsistent with natural fire. Carbon traces near the surface, as if something had once burned there, burned deeply, and then refused to thaw, and what remains is not ruin, not ash, but absence that does not decay. A cold that is not weather, but memory held in earth. The Vikings did not write of such things directly, but they knew them. In Voluspa, the seer speaks of a place where sun does not touch and time does not knock. In Helgakvida, there's a phrase, Kulda sem minningin bär, the cold that memory carries. Perhaps the birch bark map was not trying to guide anyone there. Perhaps it was marking the point beyond which one must not go. But something about the final line betrays the hand, as if the cartographer, in that last gesture, was no longer fully himself, as if memory, or nightmare, reached up through the stylus and finished the line for him, dragged it forward. There are places that do not want to be mapped, and there are maps that cannot help but name what should not be named. The cold stretch remains. Snow glistens against moss that never grows. Ice crystals bloom from stone in midsummer, and in satellite frames, the white glows slightly brighter than it should. Not light, but refusal. The cold does not speak, but it listens, and beneath its stillness lies a silence the earth cannot melt. The map did not want to end there, but the memory did. To the Vikings, myth was not a distant fiction. It was not a story placed apart from the world. It was the world, not metaphor, but matter, not belief, but terrain. When they spoke of Thor, they pointed to thunder rolling down the mountainside. When they spoke of Loki, it was not a name, but a feeling. The unease in a shifting stream, the laughter that cracks ice when no one is near. Their gods did not live apart from the land. They were the land. Myth was geography, and geography, when drawn carefully, became myth again. The footsteps of gods were said to crack stone. The tears of goddesses were said to rise as springs. A strange bend in the path, a grove where no snow fell, a cliff that sang when struck. All these things were not explained away. They were remembered as acts, as remnants, as signs of something larger having passed through. Nowhere was this truer than in the conception of hell, the cold underworld. Hell was not imagined far beneath, buried in darkness. It was beyond the known fjords, beyond the hills that held the last houses, beyond warmth, sound, even the rhythm of names. It was the last geography, the edge of sense, the far side of the map. Hell was not hell. It was not fire or punishment. It was forgetting. Cold that remembered nothing. Breath without echo. It was the land's last silence. And so, when the birch bark map ends at the edge of snow that does not melt, when its final lines coil and pierce like a seal pressed shut, perhaps it is not marking a destination at all. Perhaps it is marking a presence. Not a place one is meant to reach, but a place one must never touch. The map may be a kind of ward, a gesture not of navigation, but of containment. To draw something is to shape its memory. To bury the drawing is to bind it, to say, we will remember this enough to stay away. The sagas are full of half-spoken boundaries. A river that must not be crossed on the solstice, a mountain that is never named from the east side, a hollow where the gods stopped walking. These are not places of conflict. They are places of retreat, where myth touched the world too closely and left something behind. To modern minds, such spaces feel like superstition, the relics of fear in a colder age. But the consistency with which these boundaries appear suggests something deeper. A cartography, not of conquest, but of caution. And the map, sealed in resin and blood, buried beneath hearth and memory, may be the clearest example. Not every presence is visible. Some are known by what avoids them. The birds that do not sing, the warmth that does not stay, the line on a map that does not want to end, but must. In this way, the cursed map is both artifact and act, a tool and a prayer. It may show nothing more than a curve through snow, but it does so with a reverence that borders on fear. And in that fear is understanding that the land was not empty, that some stories shaped it and some presences never fully left. To the Vikings, mythology was the world made visible, not fiction to be believed, but memory to be navigated, even if that navigation meant knowing when to stop, to turn back, to bury the line before it could finish itself. And so they did. They drew what they feared, and buried what they drew. There is a growing murmur in the field of historical cartography, quiet but persistent, a shift in how we read ancient maps, not as instruments of navigation alone, but as rituals in themselves, as objects of power, of boundary, of warning. The question now being asked, softly and without certainty, is this: were some maps not meant to guide, but to bind? If so, the birchbark map may be one of the oldest surviving prisons in human form. Not a diagram of terrain, but a ceiling, a structure designed not to show the world, but to contain something withdrawn from it, a cartography of fear. The idea is not without precedent. In multiple ancient cultures, from the tattooed skin maps of Polynesian navigators to the labyrinthine sand drawings of the Sami no Aidi, the act of drawing was more than record. It was invocation. To mark a path was to alter it. To trace a boundary was to make it real. The Vikings, who lived with one foot in the mythic and the other in the harsh logic of winter survival, understood this duality. To draw was not just to remember, it was to shape. The birchbark fragment, scorched, blood-traced, folded and buried, bears all the signs of something made not for the eye, but for memory, and its structure resists explanation. The paths it traces are hesitant. They curve, double back, tighten. They suggest motion, but not a rival. Toward the end, the line thickens, falters, and terminates in that knot, the pierced coil. Not a place, but a seal. Recent interpretations from ritual anthropologists suggest the entire map may function like a ward, a ritual object whose meaning is not in what it reveals, but in what it hides. The map's form becomes a wall, the symbols, chains, not meant to direct travel, but to forbid it. To follow it might not lead to discovery. It might undo a forgetting carefully crafted by those who came before. In Norse magic, binding was not always performed with rope or iron. It was often done with line, with gesture, with symbol. The Galdrastafir, magical staves, were intricate shapes drawn to protect, to blind, to seal. Their power did not reside in language, but in structure, the way the line turned, the way the spiral closed. These were not illustrations. They were cages. And so, perhaps is this. The birchbark map may be a diagram of containment, not a prison for the body, but for memory, for presence, for the kind of knowing that, once loosed, cannot be undone. The placement beneath the hearth, the sealing with resin, the faint trace of blood, all suggest a ritual act. Not preservation, not storage, something more sacred, more fearful. The sagas do not speak directly of such things, but they circle them. In tales where paths loop endlessly until oaths are sworn. In stories where the ground must not be broken, lest something beneath remember its shape. One poem speaks of a land folded into a line, a fear that sleeps beneath frost. What sleeps beneath frost? That, too, is a kind of map. The modern eye, trained to seek information, finds frustration in such fragments, but these were never made to be complete. They were not puzzles to solve. They were locks made whole by their silence. Their refusal to explain is the point, and now, in museums and archives, the fragments sit, studied, analyzed, compared, but never fully known. Because to know them entirely may be to break them, and no one truly knows what lies beneath. Was it a grief too large to carry? A ritual gone too deep? A presence mistaken for God? Or worse, mistaken for absence? To follow the map may not lead us to a place. It may lead us to a memory that was not ours to keep. A breath once bound in bark. A silence held together by line and fire. A warning that begins to uncoil the moment we try to read it. In this way, the map is not guidance, it is resistance. And we would do well to remember that some paths were drawn so we would never walk them. There is a village, or rather, the remains of one, tucked into the hem of the north where the sky leans low and light scatters without warmth. Its name is mostly lost now, softened by time and the vanishing of those who once shaped it with their breath. A hamlet of no more than a dozen homes, long since wind-blown into ruin, where the moss grows taller than the doorways and reindeer paths trace only the edges. But it left behind a whisper, one that does not belong to the sagas, nor to any written record, a chant passed only between midwives, soft as breath, carried from woman to woman in the hush before birth. Not as comfort, but as memory. Or perhaps as warning, it was never sung in full voice, only in low hums, in the spaces between contractions, in the long silences that precede first cries. It is not meant to calm the child, but to remind the one delivering them that not all beginnings are safe, that not all lines, once crossed, allow return. The chant is fragmentary now, but certain phrases endure. In a dialect almost vanished, it speaks of a svartlin I snjoljosi, a black line through snowlight, a path not drawn but burned. That appears only when one has forgotten what they were seeking. And at the end of it, always, is a figure, a woman, neither young nor old, with salt for eyes, waiting. She's not described in beauty or horror, only in presence, as if her existence does not require adjectives. She simply is, standing at the terminus of something. Still, listening. The chant stops just before its end. Always. Generations agreed on this. The final word is never sung. It is held in the mouth, then released without sound. A pause so deliberate it becomes sacred. And that pause, that unspoken syllable, matches the last mark on the birch bark map. A rune not found in any canonical futhark. A spiral, interrupted, pierced from above. A symbol scholars argue over still. Was it invented or forgotten? A name or its removal? In this chant, it becomes both. It is the sound withheld, the gesture abandoned, the breath returned to silence. Those who have tried to sing the final word, out of curiosity or defiance, report strange sensations. Tightness in the throat, cold across the fingertips, a forgetting not of place or time, but of reason, as if the body remembers that it should not finish, as if the silence has more memory than the sound ever did. The midwives who carried the chant did not teach it widely. It was not written down. It passed only in need, in blood, in breath. And when the last of them passed away in the early 1970s, the chant nearly vanished with them. But one ethnographer, visiting for unrelated research, recorded a partial version. The tape now sits in a drawer at a northern archive, rarely requested. Those who listen to it note a strange static toward the end, not interference, but presence, the sense that the room, somehow, grows larger. This is not superstition, it is structure, ritual held in rhythm, silence built into song. The chant is the vocal echo of what the map does in form. Both gesture toward something final, not death, but ending. The kind of end that leaves the ground smooth, the breath cold, and the name unsaid. Why the village preserved it is unclear. They spoke of it rarely, even among themselves, but it was remembered. Through centuries of frost and famine, war and migration, they held that one chant, passed it like salt, sparingly, carefully, because they knew something we have forgotten. That memory does not always want to be remembered, that some truths are not to be spoken, but held, briefly, then let go, and that at the end of the black line in the snow light, she is still waiting, silent, patient, listening for the word no one dares to say. The birch bark fragment should be still. After all these centuries, sealed in resin, buried in hearth ash, handled only with gloves in the sterile silence of archives. It should be finished, fossilized, quiet, but it is not. Under high-resolution imaging taken over the last 3 decades, something has begun to stir. It is not obvious at first, a faint darkening, a curve that thickens where once it had faded, a segment of line that seems to inch forward, just enough to disrupt previous scans. At first, it was dismissed, a flaw in the imaging, a trick of light, moisture, pressure. But repeated scans across different labs tell the same story. One corner of the map is not staying the same. It is shifting, changing, not quickly, but undeniably. A section that had nearly disappeared, a pale curve tucked beneath the known path, is now darker than the marks that surround it. It emerges not as if redrawn, but as if revealed, as though something once buried in the fibers of the birch is rising line by line into view. Carbon tracing shows no new pigment. The bark has not been tampered with. The ink, such as it is, has not been applied again. The map is sealed beneath centuries-old resin, impermeable, untouched. And yet the lines swell, slightly, as if from within, as if the birch itself is remembering. Some researchers propose a chemical process. The birch, they argue, may be reacting to temperature or handling, the old pigments becoming more visible as the organic material subtly reshapes. But even those most committed to this view acknowledge the anomaly. No other bark fragments from the same dig behave this way. Not one. The swelling follows no known pattern, not mold, not weathering. It pushes only from one quadrant, the lower right, where the map once ended abruptly in a faint, fading coil. That line now curves, more fully, as though something long pressed down is beginning to rise. This is not animation, not life, but it is resistance, the resistance of an object not ready to die. The birch bark map, whatever else it may be, does not decay the way it should. Its edges, though fragile, have not split. Its burn marks, though ancient, retain unnatural sharpness. The resin, tested under microscopy, shows no clouding, no breakdown. It preserves the map not just in form, but in purpose, as if the act of burial had not sealed the object, but held it like breath, waiting. There is a theory, still fringe, still spoken in low academic tones, that the map was never complete, that it was not meant to be fixed, that its lines were not static but temporal, meant to emerge, to change, depending on who held it or when. Like a wound that opens not in flesh, but in meaning. If this is true, then the map is not a memory, it is a process, and that process is not over. The latest scans suggest the emerging curve, once thought incidental, mirrors the final path described in the Ashwife's chant. The black line through snow light, it had been too faint to read before. But now it leads, not sharply, not clearly, but undeniably. It moves. This frightens some, it comforts no one. Because if the map is still changing, then it still has something left to do, something left to warn, and no one truly knows what will happen when its last line is finally drawn. The birch bark fragment, though fragile in form, carries a weight few institutions are willing to bear. It should, by every metric, be a prized object, an artifact of extraordinary age, burned with unidentifiable tools, traced with organic compounds that resist categorization, sealed with a resin whose structure remains intact after centuries. And yet, it has passed like a shadow through the hands of archivists and museum boards, studied briefly, and then refused. At least 3 Scandinavian archives have quietly declined to house it. The Museum of Folkloric Artifacts in Trondheim filed an initial acceptance, then rescinded it days later, citing energy issues in the storage wing, though the wing in question remained functional and open to public tours. A private collection in Copenhagen took the object for 2 months before returning it without explanation. The shipping documents signed only with initials, but the most telling refusal came from a northern Swedish research archive, where the application to transfer the artifact was returned, unprocessed, with one phrase scrawled in pencil beneath the institutional seal: "Too recent to be old." No further elaboration was offered, but the phrase remains, unsettling in its simplicity, as if something in the bark does not belong fully to the past, as if the map has not finished becoming what it is meant to be. Digital scans have proven similarly difficult. The bark was photographed, measured, X-rayed, but every attempt to digitize its lines ends in slow corrosion. Not immediate failure, but subtle decay. Files degrade with no clear cause. Pixelation creeps inward from the edges. Metadata warps. A recurring issue arises. File names do not hold. The system renames the image or leaves it untitled entirely, as if the file refuses to anchor itself. The artifact slips, even in code. One team in Oslo reported that even physical copies, laser prints of the scans, curled at the edges after a week, despite climate control. Ink bled in soft radial patterns, always toward the lower right corner, the same quadrant where the birch bark's own line has begun to darken. Some curators now keep only photographs, analog, archived in sleeves, labeled not with the map's name, but with neutral terms. Fragment A, wood sample, unclassified. As if naming it draws something closer, as if proximity is not physical but conceptual. To think of the map is to edge nearer to it. To name it is to remember. And remembering seems to cost something. A few who have handled the original speak of headaches, of strange dreams, of waking with the sense that something has shifted, but not within the room, within the self. One conservator refused to be alone with the object. Another insisted on wearing gloves, even when looking at photographs. "It wants to be closer," she said. "That's enough." None of this is verifiable. None of it belongs in reports. But the refusals mount, quietly, uneasily, as if the object carries not just memory, but momentum. It is as though the map was not made to be displayed, not meant to rest in glass. It resists exhibition. It resists ownership. It resists being looked at too long, or held too closely, or named too often. Perhaps that is the function of a seal. Not only to close something off, but to keep those who find it from becoming part of it. And so it drifts between collections, photographed, then stored, scanned, then forgotten, studied, then lost to mislabeled drawers. Never quite settled, always nearby, but never with. Proximity changes things, not always visibly, but in the air, in the memory, in the quiet discomfort that spreads slowly, like cold in the bone. The map resists being owned because ownership suggests understanding, and there is nothing in it that wishes to be understood, only carried, only passed, and perhaps, eventually, put down again. Not out of fear, but out of something deeper, something that feels very much like the instinct to forget. At the end of the map, where the final line curves too deeply and the mark presses into the birch bark like a wound, there is a place the wind will not echo. Not cannot. Will not. Wind moves there. You can feel it on the skin, cold and constant. It pulls at clothing, stirs the grasses, carries the scent of frost and stone, but it does not speak. No whistle through the cliffs, no low rumble along rock, not even the soft susurration of air between branches. The wind moves, and the sound of its movement ends. There is no silence. There is removal. Snow falls thick and heavy, but footsteps vanish. The familiar crunch, that fragile collapse beneath weight, is absent. One researcher described the snow as falling into itself. Another wrote in her journal, "I walk, but nothing hears me walk. Fire won't catch, not fully. Matches strike. Sparks rise, but the flame resists form. Kindling darkens, but does not burn. Smoke curls once, then flattens. It is not wind that kills the fire. It is atmosphere, a weight that pushes downward, denying combustion, a presence in the absence. Those who have visited, few and never more than once, speak carefully, if at all." One audio technician brought field recorders. All of them failed, not violently. No static, no distortion, just nothing. The files exist, but play as blank. Even background hum vanishes, as if the machines entered a room with no acoustics, a room sealed not with walls, but with forgetting. She tried to narrate the trip afterward. Her notes stopped mid-sentence. The final entry reads, "Landscape looks natural. Sky is clear. Wind." That's where it ends. There is no anomaly in the terrain. Satellite imagery shows tundra, stone, sparse moss. Snowpack consistent with elevation. No thermal variance, no radiation, no sinkholes or unusual magnetic fields. And yet, sensors fail. Batteries drain. Cameras capture images, but never the same image twice. Angles seem to shift between frames, even when mounted. It appears natural, but behaves like a sealed room. As if the air has been instructed not to carry memory. As if every element, wind, snow, sound, fire, has agreed to participate in the forgetting. The Sami in nearby regions do not name the place. They speak around it. They acknowledge only that animals avoid it. Not in fear, but in absence. Migration paths bend wide around it. Herds pass it as if it were not there. Dogs go silent at its edge. The birch bark map ends just before this stretch of land, but the last line strains toward it. That final gesture of the cartographer's hand, thick and reluctant, like something drawn not willingly, but pulled. Not a direction, a compulsion. This is not the place where a journey ends. It is where sound goes to die. Some theorize the map was not meant to describe this place, but to keep it sealed. That the drawn line, the burned symbol, the blood-traced ridge, all were acts of resistance. Memory fighting to create one last outline before silence took everything. But the place remains, quiet, undisturbed, or undisturbable. Not sacred, not cursed, just unreachable in a way that defies distance, because some landscapes are not made of earth and sky. Some are made of endings, and the place at the map's end does not echo, because it remembers too much to speak.